in touch with another reality so deeply that they feel called to overcome their fears about what other people are going to think of them for expressing this, and that they have to find some kind of artistic outlet, some kind of way to express their being in touch with this other reality. And I chose the quote from his poetry to begin the book. Reality is what has been concealed from us for so long, because that is what his core mission as an artist was, a major one. And that was to show people, he was always going on stage saying, wake up, really loudly. It's because he appropriated his really powerful presence, to help wake up an entire generation to what everybody at that time was ready for, the unseen, the spirit world. And for about 400 years, up until now, that has been largely put down. In the 200 years after the Renaissance, belief in cosmic consciousness, an unseen world, the spirit world, was seen as something insane. And expressing that can get you into a lot of trouble with the church, with the Inquisition, with government authorities. They just didn't want to have that. And that started to, recede in the late 1800s with people like Aleister Crowley and Blavatsky. And then after World War I and World War II, it resurged, and the first popular occult awakening in all of human history happened in the 1960s. Jim Morrison said that he coincided with the birth of rock and roll. Well, he also coincided with something just as spectacular, and that was everybody suddenly just becoming quite interested in yoga and witchcraft and studying the occult, and all kinds of very deep existential books with a real mystical edge to it. And the Secret Teachers of the Western World, Gary Lackman has a really great phrase that I like a lot. And he says that after World War II, people were opening themselves up to that which he called that which is new, alien, and other. So back then, everyone was just ready for somebody like Jim Morrison, who had a new alien and other kind of presence to him. And out of the many things that were really genius in his work, one of them is that he had a really strong awareness, and one was his erotism and his mysteriousness. And he was able to appropriate that on stage and in photography in order to lure you into what I call in the book, his magical kingdom. This was someone who, through my research, I was very surprised by everything that I was finding. And with Jim Morrison, you have to go all the way back to Hellenistic Alexandria in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century CE, when Alexandria was founded. And it was founded by Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great's teacher when he was a boy was none other than Aristotle. And Aristotle taught him that every human being has a very strong desire to know, has a very strong drive and curiosity for the unknown. And after Alexander the Great had, went on his campaigns where he conquered it so much, he was very depressed that there was nothing left to conquer. But the one thing he did was found the city of Alexandria in honor of what Aristotle had taught him, and that's where the great library, formed. That was there for centuries, in which many scholars and secret teachers and mystical people and artistic people came from all over the ancient world to congregate around this library. That's where the Western esoteric tradition was born, and this is a place where Jim Morrison would have felt right at home. So, in a very strange and mysterious sense, Jim Morrison just seems to pick up where Alexander the Great, leads off, and that the only thing left to discover was to rediscover, that other reality that Aristotle had alluded to. And throughout the centuries of the Western esoteric tradition, after the fall of the Roman Empire, up until the Italian Renaissance, this library, was fostering this desire to know until the rise of classical Islam, and everything that was taught there, was called, became called the rejected knowledge. And then it had, while Europe was in its dark ages, it was located in Haran, Turkey, and then it was discovered right before the Italian Renaissance. It made its way into Italy. Someone named Cosimo de' Medici had an Italian philosopher named Ficino translate all these texts, and that gave birth to the Italian Renaissance. And then it flowered there again. What happened in Hellenistic Alexandria flowered there again, like in the Italian Renaissance. But in the 200 years after the Italian Renaissance, to get back to what I began with, someone named Morrison wrote something called Celeberrime Questiones in Genesum. And this tract basically said that all belief in cosmic consciousness, all ascension, all spirituality, all spiritual awakening, all of these things were to be seen as insane, as criminal. And anybody engaging in that kind of activity was just, you came up against the Inquisition, you came up against the church, you even came up against people that were involved in, they were actually against the Catholic Church, the Reformation, the rise of Protestantism. And this continued for 400 years. And throughout this time, there were a lot of different secret teachers who went underground with their studies. In 1946, when John Maynard Keynes bought all the property rights in the estate of Sir Isaac Newton, he discovered that Sir Isaac Newton was deeply engaged in alchemical studies. But Sir Isaac Newton was smart. He had to keep that a secret, because it was found out, he would be burned at the stake. It wasn't just the belief in cosmic consciousness and engaging in occult activity that got you in trouble. Back then, monarchs felt that if you were going to discover gold, that you could corner the financial market. You could put an entire king or queen's government right out of power if you suddenly figured out how to make gold, and perhaps go to their enemy and tell them how to do that. It was a great fear back then. So in Jim Morrison's time, it wasn't much in the 60s. It wasn't much different than the Italian mathematician Giordano Bruno in the Italian Renaissance, who went around telling people that there are unseen worlds, there is an unseen reality, there is another reality, there are even exoplanets and extra dimensions and all this kind of stuff. Hypatia, a woman who was a great mathematician in Hellenistic Alexandria, she had experiences like gnosis, which without any kind of scientific technology, she was able to understand that planets revolve around the sun like an ellipsis. They were all engaged in these people were very connected to the universe. Their minds are very powerful. They just receive knowledge. Like gnosis is instantaneous reception of spiritual knowledge, knowledge about the universe. This frightened many people, and that was one of the reasons why people with secret teachers, they were just very weary of them, right? But their times were such that there is just enough acceptance of who they were where they could thrive, and they could do their work, and they could find people that liked them, supported them, knew that they were important, knew that they were doing great things. Also, there were just people that in places of authority that they were frightened by them, or envious them, or jealous them, or saw that the whole idea to wake people up through their divine light within, that you can come into a place of cosmic consciousness, that you can be an empowered individual, was very threatening to how they just wanted to govern their people, what they wanted to do. That, especially in the times after the Italian Renaissance, after that, the Catholic Church was like, we're just not going to have this anymore. Hypatia endured a brutal death. They dragged her out of the Serapeum in Alexandria, and they executed her by scraping her body with shells and rocks. It was awful. Giordano Bruno, he was burned at the stake by the Pope in 1600. After spending 7 years in prison, and he would not recant on his ideas at all. He was very steadfast. So when you go back to Jim Morrison's time, all of the traits and everything about these secret teachers, Jim Morrison in his life matched. And there was just enough going on in the United States and the Western world where people were ready for Jim Morrison, like I said, and what he represented and what he was about. With Jim Morrison, you get somebody who had the physical stamina and the looks and the attitude and everything that goes with being like a super fun rock star and everything like that. But also you have everything that is about what all these secret teachers were throughout the Western esoteric tradition. And Jim Morrison was no different in these people, which he very astutely saw that rock and roll was a new way in which he could express this. If rock and roll did not exist, then he would have become an experimental filmmaker. He almost moved to New York City to work with Jonas Mekas, who was the godfather of experimental filmmaking, but he decided not to do that after graduating from UCLA. At least because moving to New York meant he'd have to get a job and take care of equipment and live in an apartment, all that kind of stuff, right? So as bright as he was and as creative and artistic he was, he saw that rock and roll was a new art form to do this, and people were ready for it. Another writer in the past said, Jim Morrison is like the accidental rock star. The more that you look into this, I can see how this writer will come up with this, but I really think there's something really magical and divine to Jim Morrison's life and how this occurred. At any other time, I don't think the Jim Morrison, the Doors, would have been as commercially successful as they were in the 60s, because so many people were of the frame of mind to accept this person and what they wanted to get across at their core, with their songs. It's not like you can go to a Doors concert and get, instant enlightenment or instant spiritual waking or anything like that. It was more so Morrison appropriated his very provocative energy into waking people up, and people leaving Doors shows would their common reactions were like, I have no idea what I just saw. I'm going to be thinking about it for days. And then they would, later on say that they found themselves being more turned on to different books and different ideas and different things than they had before. Morrison also said that he received a lot of letters that were very intelligent and very sensitive from his fans, that he was very humbled by it, because he realized that going into rock music, for what he wanted to achieve, it was working. It was having the intended effect to affect a change in consciousness, which is what a lot of secret teachers have wanted to do throughout the Western esoteric tradition. So there's a lot of people accepting. At the same time, there's a lot of people who are not accepting of that. And it didn't make it matters any better for him, because he was the eldest son of one of America's most outstanding military officers. His father was first he was an aircraft carrier captain, and then he went on to become a rear admiral in the Navy. And at the height of the Doors' fame, between 68 and 71, when Morrison was going through frequent arrests and all that kind of stuff, we all know that story. His father actually went to the Navy and offered his resignation, saying, listen, my son is embarrassing, it's embarrassing the Navy, I'll resign. And they were grooming this man to become a person one day who would serve in the Joint Chiefs of Staff or someone like that. Morrison's father flew fighters in World War II, Hellcats in the Navy. He was present in Pearl Harbor the day that it was attacked. His father was every bit as impressive in his own way. So the big concert that everybody knows about in March 1st, 1969 in Miami at Dinner Auditorium, where you alleged that he flashed the audience, showed his junk to the audience, right? Well, 10,000 photographs were submitted during that trial, and not one showed Jim Morrison doing that. And out of all the testimony at that trial, no one could recall him doing anything like that at that show. That show was on March 1st, 69. On March 5th, 1969, the arrest warrants were issued for his arrest by the Dade County Law Enforcement in Miami. And also the FBI field office, their agents, they sent a description of the show in which it states that he flashed the audience. And they sent this description, this memo, directly to J. Edgar Hoover's office, who was the then feared FBI director at the time. This is when Richard Nixon was president. And Nixon was the one who, when he got word that John Lennon was about to go on an anti-war tour with Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and that immediately, he was a very paranoid man, so that immediately he went into this whole thing where we got to get this guy deported. So that was Richard Nixon's mindset. So there's a lot of smoke there, but there is some fire to suggest that going up to the federal government level, they were really seeking to end Jim Morrison's career. And without any evidence to prove that he was guilty of this, beyond a reasonable doubt, he was convicted of indecent exposure that night, a felony, and he was sentenced to 6 months of incarceration, hard labor. And they were going to send him to the most notorious prison in Florida, up in North Central Florida, called Rayford Prison. It's a really violent place. But he remained free on appeal, and his lawyers were telling him that there's a good chance that he's going to get off because the case is just so flimsy. In 2010, when Charlie Crist was governor, the Florida Clemency Court finally dismissed the charges against Jim Morrison posthumously. But at the time, The appeal wasn't set for 1972, so Jim Morrison decided that he was going to go to Paris, and he told then towards manager Bill Siddons that, I really don't know who I am. I want to get back in touch with writing poetry. I want to get back in touch with myself after all of this. So you're Jim Morrison in Paris, and your lawyers are telling you that you're going to get off on appeal, but I strongly feel that he was telling himself, but I've already been convicted of something that I did not do. And if I lose on appeal, I'm going to a very violent prison for at least 6 months. When he was in Paris, before him and Pamela Corson moved into their apartment in the 4th arrondissement in the Marais district, they lived in Oscar Wilde's room where he died. Oscar Wilde was an English writer in the 1800s, and they sent him to prison for 2 years for moral turpitude, moral corruption, with a lot of bullshit. And he decided that he was going to go to Paris to try to get his life back together because his prison sentence really deteriorated his health. It was really bad. Unfortunately, in Paris, he did not recover, and he died there. And I don't know how it is they ended up staying in this room, but they were living in that room before they moved into their apartment. And then 3 months later, Jim Morrison passed away, and they buried him in Père Lachaise, where they buried Oscar Wilde as well. But it's hard to believe that Jim Morrison wasn't very, very anxious about what would happen to him if he went back to the United States. He did tell one of his friends that he wanted some kind of assurance that he would not be thrown into Rayford prison if he lost on appeal. This is similar to Giordano Bruno's story. In the late 1500s, he had to leave Italy because they had enough of him in Italy, and he did find patronage around Europe to continue his work. But he decided that to go back to Italy, to Venice. This is in 1592, because he thought, well, maybe they have forgotten about me. It's been several years. I can go off my work. I found a very rich patron there. He's going to put me up, and I can continue my work with them. And he took a risk, and he went back to Italy. He got there, and things were going fine. Giordano Bruno was a very rambunctious man and got into an argument with his patron, and then his patron turned him over to the Inquisition, the Roman Catholic authorities. And then, as I said, they put him in jail for 6-7 years, and then they had him executed at the stake in 1600. So these kinds of things were going through Jim Morrison's mind, I strongly believe, when he was in Paris. And so there's 3 places here in the United States in the 50s and 60s that were like the hotbed for like the beatniks and the bohemians, and that was Greenwich Village in New York and then North Beach in San Francisco. But also the one that was less fashionable was in Venice Beach. The beatnik poets and painters and writers there were every bit as talented as Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and all the ones that we know. But there were these people like Larry Lipton, who wrote The Holy Barbarians. They just didn't care to be commercially successful. They weren't after fame or anything like that. They were just in it for the creativity, for the spirit, and for the art. And if you appreciated them, fine. If you didn't, their attitude was like, just fuck off. Larry Lipton in The Holy Barbarians, he wrote a poem that he included in Giordano Bruno and other poems. And he wrote a poem about Giordano Bruno, coming to Venice in California, where he would be executed. And he wrote this poem about 4 or 5 years before Jim Morrison came to Venice in 1965. This is 1959, 1950. It's just very mysterious and uncanny that Larry Lipton writes his poem, because it's almost if he's foreseeing what may happen to Jim Morrison when he comes to Venice himself. It's out of all the beatnik types that moved to Venice Beach, where everyone did not care at all about fame, fortune, or anything like that, its toughest one is the one who became really famous. Venice Beach in 1965 was absolutely not the Venice Beach that it is today. It was like dilapidated shacks, rambling, rundown houses. Like the canals were not taken care of. It was much quieter. You can get a sense of Venice in Chris Christopherson's first film called Cisco Pike, and you can see him walking around Venice. And he actually, in one scene, sits in the soul food restaurant where Jim Morrison used to go to a lot, in which he inspired him to write Soul Kitchen, a place called Olivia's Place. And there's a scene that takes place in that soul food restaurant where Jim Morrison hung out a lot. So kind of like to wrap all of this up, I just really strongly believe that Jim Morrison's life, um, it mirrors like the whole history of what Gary Lappin calls in The Secret Teacher of the Western World, the rejected knowledge. Like everything that we've accumulated just from our study of the unknown, everything from like yoga to tarot cards, to alchemy. Um, in Jim Morrison's book of poetry, The Lords and the New Creatures, the first part is called Notes on Vision, and when he's 19, 20 years old, he writes extensively about alchemy, among many things. And they're very astute observations in how they relate to experimental cinema. I mean, understanding alchemy is not exactly something that a 19, 20-year-old can do. I quickly deduced over all of my research that when he graduated in 21, this is someone who had the intellectual maturity of someone between the age 35 and 40 with a PhD. I mean, it's extraordinary. At the same time, his friend said, Philip Lino said that he was a very, very old soul who also was someone who was like, pretty immature. Like, he was just kind of nuts sometimes, right? A lot like his Arthur Rimbaud, who wrote all of his poetry by the time he was 20, like the famous boy poet that influenced Bob Dylan and Patti Smith and Jim Morrison, also like, running away from home and, doing all this kind of stuff, going to Paris. We know all that story. What really kicked off, what really made me write this book is when, after I read Secret Teachers, I found a video online of a roommate that he had in college, a man named Ed Martin, when Jim Morrison was at FSU. And he was auctioning off a book that Jim Morrison gave him called The History of Magic and the Occult by Kurt Seligman. And Jim Morrison found this book the last 2 years in high school in Alexandria, Virginia, at a local branch library. He never returned it. He kept it until he gave it away to his friend in 1963. And I became really, really curious about this book. I had a suspicion that this book is a lot like Secret Teachers of the Western World, and it is. It's one of the very first accounts of the Western esoteric tradition. And Kurt Seligman was a very artistic person. He was really talented. He was a surrealist painter, and he came to New York in between somewhere between 1945 and 1950. This book was published in 1949 when it was translated, and all the surrealists came then because they were escaping the Nazis. People like Andre Breton and all of them. And they brought all of their ideas to New York, and they intermingled with all the local painters, like one of those being like Jackson Pollock. And out of that, emerged what we know as abstract expressionism. So it's a very artistic book if you take a look at it. Like Secret Teachers of the Western World, I love. Also The Occult by Colin Wilson, is fantastic. All these three books have a lot in common. So he kept this book, and I think it put him in touch with what was going on with him and gave him an idea about who he was and what his mission would be in a very broad evolutionary sense when it comes to who we are, and our curiosity, going back to what Aristotle talked about. We all have a very deep desire to know. And back then, there's no Barnes and Noble to go to with an extensive section on self-transformation books in the occult. There's no internet. There's no anything. It's just him with what's going on with him. And I found a book called The Stormy Search for the Self, which is by Christina and Stanislav Grof. I think it's the best book on spiritual awakening, and it talks about what people are going through when they're waking up, when they're beginning to understand that it's not just this three-dimensional reality. There's just everything outside of what the five senses and the rational mind can't really understand. It's a hectic time in a person's life. It's a chaotic time, and all of their descriptions in this book matched the descriptions of what Hopkins and Sugarman were describing when he was a teenager in Alexandria, Virginia. I mean, he was telling walkers to his teachers, saying like, "Hey, I've got a brain tumor I'm going to get operated on," like an excuse, like to go get out of class and go read. Like the most popular fraternity in the high school invited him to join, and he said no. He's like, "I don't want to conform. This is going to waste my time." He's just elsewhere. Like, this is someone who can't wait to just do his class assignments, do what he needs to do at school, and then go to the library and go be by himself to read. By the time he's 18 years old, he has over 1,000 books in his room. Like, this person is searching. This person is waking up. His behavior is very erratic. Tandy Martin, his first girlfriend, his mother said, like, stay away from him. Like, he's like unclean. Like, there's just something wrong with him. He was going to the Library of Congress and checking out books on 14th, 15th century demonology. He was he was going to all kinds of out-of-the-way bookstores all over Washington, D.C., getting any kind of book that he could find on esotericism, on the occult, on mysticism, on the history of all of this. And the right books at the right time seemed to have, they were finding him. So at the end of this video on YouTube, you can all see it with Ed Martin. The auctioneer asked him, like, what was he like? And he said, well, like, he was a very polite person. He was also like the smartest person, that I ever met. He talks about he would fall asleep at night listening to the transistor radio on the radio station whenever they had their Elvis Presley special come on. And that he was either always reading, always journaling, or always cracking jokes. He said he was a very, very funny person. And that he never saw him again, after that. And that he kept that book and he looked over it over time. And the book on its own was like $100, but the auctioneer was like, since Jim Morrison signed it, it was worth about $10,000. I just really think that Jim Morrison kind of embodies, to my really great surprise, like he embodies a lot of what the secret teachers before him had. And all of the epics in the Western esoteric tradition that they lived, both him and what was going on in the United States in the 1960s, it all just kind of like coalesced in him. Certainly people like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix in their ways too. Those are very spiritual people also. And everything that was going on, in Europe and the United States and across the world at that time. Alexander the Great was someone he really admired a lot. And he read everything that he could about him, like in Plutarch's Lives. And he's discovering all about Hellenistic Alexandria there in Alexandria, Virginia, like with his own private library. And then he makes his way all the way to Venice, California, where like there's another Renaissance going on also. I mean, the 1960s was a great Renaissance in and of itself. It's very, very mysterious how in so many ways Jim Morrison parallels and holds all these traits of all these people in the Western esoteric tradition, and I just really strongly feel that it's just to do him justice for his legacy, to start looking at his poetry and his lyrics, the things that he said in his interviews. He had what Harold Bloom called an authorial consciousness, like you just want to quote him on everything. I mean, it's an amazing kind of maturity to have, in your early 20s. Like, I certainly wasn't of that kind of mindset back then. I know we all, it's lots of fun to read, the biographies about, making money and having a great time and living a fast life and all the drunkenness and the parties and the arrests and all the very deep mysteriousness surrounding his death in Paris. But that's just a very small part. That's just all the sensational side of all of that. I became friends with Bill Cosgrave, he wrote a book called Jim Morrison, Mary and Me. And he said that he was very good friends with Mary Warbelow, who was Jim Morrison's college girlfriend. And she told him when she went to go see the Oliver Stone film that that's only about 25% of Jim. The rest of him is not there. So, hopefully, in the future we'll have like a much bigger picture of who Jim Morrison was, and maybe we'll start with my book and like what other people discover about him. So, thanks. I hope that made sense.